By the time the first autumn rain swept through Portland, Grace Bennett had already learned more about endurance than most people twice her age. At 22, in her final year at Portland State University, she was studying linguistics, a choice that seemed practical when scholarships were scarce and every dollar mattered. Her father had died of a heart attack when she was 10, leaving behind not just a grieving wife and daughter, but a mountain of quiet struggles. Her mother, once vibrant and full of laughter, had sunk into a long, stubborn depression, and with it came chronic health problems that often kept her homebound. Since high school, Grace had shouldered the weight of their little family. Her days followed a grueling rhythm, classes from morning to late afternoon, then straight to her evening shift at a small neighborhood bar just off Burnside Street. The few hours left at night were divided between coursework, cooking, and snatches of restless sleep. Weekends weren't rest days, they were opportunities to take on odd jobs, distributing flyers, cleaning houses, babysitting. Once, she had tried washing cars, but most places turned her away when they learned she was under 18. There had been years when even her classmates laughed or felt heavier than her backpack. They mocked the worn-out clothes she rotated through the week, the second-hand backpack she'd patched 3 times. At first, it had stung. Later, she realized their words couldn't pay the rent or keep the lights on. They didn't know what it was like to look into your mother's tired eyes and swear that somehow you'd make things better. Working at the bar had been the best compromise she could find. The pay wasn't great, but the tips helped keep food on the table, and the owner was kind enough to let her study in the back during slow nights. It wasn't glamorous, wiping tables sticky from beer spills and smiling at customers who barely looked at her, but it kept them afloat. That particular Thursday night had started like any other. By 6 p.m., Grace had tied her hair back into a neat ponytail and slipped into her black apron. The autumn air outside was damp and heavy, the smell of rain drifting through the cracked door as regulars trickled in. Most came in pairs or groups, their laughter bouncing off the walls. But at table 7, a man sat alone. Mid-30s, maybe early 40s. Expensive suit, wedding band, hair slightly disheveled, and eyes that looked like they hadn't rested in weeks. "Could I get another, please?" he asked quietly, lifting his glass. Grace forced a polite smile and nodded. "Of course. Right away." By the time she returned, it was his 3rd glass of brandy. He wasn't belligerent, not like the usual troublemakers who stumbled in after midnight. If anything, there was something unbearably sad about him, as if he were trying to drown a grief too heavy to name. The hours dragged on. By 9:45, the crowd had thinned, leaving only a few tables occupied. The man at table 7 was still there, swirling the last drops of brandy, eyes fixed on nothing. Then, as if something inside him snapped, he turned on a group of laughing college kids nearby, slurring accusations about their noise. Before Grace could intervene, Colia, the bouncer, appeared and escorted him out with practiced efficiency. She sighed, shaking her head. There were always people like him. Heartbreak wrapped in too much alcohol. But when her shift finally ended and she stepped outside, umbrella raised against the steady rain, she saw him again. Slumped on a bench near the curb, soaked through, his head bowed. Passers-by gave him wide berths, some glancing over with disdain, others ignoring him entirely. Grace hesitated. This wasn't her problem. He was a stranger, and she had an exam the next morning, a dinner to cook, a paper to finish. She could walk away, but she didn't. "Sir, are you okay?" she asked, stepping closer. No response. His eyes were half closed, his breathing slow and shallow. He wasn't unconscious, but close enough. If he stayed out here in the cold rain all night, he could end up in the hospital or worse. "God, Grace," she muttered to herself, "you're going to regret this." It took nearly 10 minutes to coax a taxi into stopping, and even then, the driver grumbled about hauling a drunk passenger. Grace lied and said he was her boyfriend, offering double fare to get him home. When they finally reached her small apartment on the east side, the driver helped her carry him inside. She laid him gently on the couch, removed his soaked jacket and shoes, and placed a glass of water and 2 aspirin tablets on the coffee table with a note. Take these when you wake up. As a final precaution, an old student habit, she set a bucket beside the couch. It was past midnight by the time she crawled into bed, exhausted and anxious about the stranger now sleeping in her living room. But beneath the worry, there was also a faint, inexplicable certainty that her life had just shifted, even if she couldn't yet see how. Morning light crept softly through the thin curtains of Grace's apartment, landing on the rumpled couch where the stranger had spent the night. But when she stepped into the living room, rubbing the sleep from her eyes, the couch was empty. The man was gone. The blanket she'd draped over him was neatly folded. The water glass was empty, and the aspirin tablets were missing. In their place sat a small note written in tidy handwriting and a dark green business card. I can't put into words how grateful I am for your kindness. Thank you for helping a stranger who didn't deserve it. If there's any way I can repay you, please don't hesitate to call or visit me at the address below. It was signed Ethan Caldwell with a phone number and a downtown address printed on the card. Caldwell, Global Solutions. Grace stared at it for a long time. Gratitude wasn't what she had expected. Trouble, maybe. Awkwardness, probably. But not gratitude. And certainly not from someone who clearly belonged to a world far removed from her own. A world of corporate logos and embossed business cards. She tucked the card into a drawer and tried to forget about it. For the next few days, she convinced herself that going there was a bad idea. She didn't know this man. He could be dangerous, manipulative, or just pitying her. And what would she even say if she showed up? Hi, remember me? The girl who dragged your drunk self off a park bench. But the thought wouldn't leave her alone. Each time she opened that drawer, the card stared back at her like an unfinished sentence. On the 4th night, her mother, Margaret, noticed her distracted silence over dinner. Something's on your mind, she said gently, spooning soup into her bowl. Grace hesitated. It's that man from the other night. He left a note and a business card. He wants me to visit. Her mother looked at her over the rim of her glasses. And why haven't you? I don't know. It just feels weird. Like I'd be intruding. Margaret smiled faintly. Grace, you help someone when no one else would. If he wants to thank you properly, let him. And if it turns out to be nothing, you'll still have done a good thing. It was simple advice, but it lingered in Grace's mind. A week later, she finally slipped the card into her pocket and boarded the Max Light rail downtown. The address led her to a gleaming glass building in the heart of Portland's business district, far from the shabby student apartments and thrift stores she was used to. Her reflection in the mirrored lobby doors made her hesitate. Second-hand blazer, scuffed boots, messenger bag worn thin from years of use. She almost turned back, but she didn't. Can I help you? The security guard at the front desk asked when she stepped inside. I have an appointment with Mr. Caldwell, she said, showing him the card. The guard made a quick call and then nodded. Top floor. He's expecting you. Her pulse raced as the elevator climbed higher and higher. When the doors opened, she found herself in a corridor lined with frosted glass doors and framed photographs of international cityscapes. A receptionist guided her to an office at the end of the hall. Come in, a voice called when she knocked. The man from the bar was standing by the window, hands in his pockets. He looked younger than she'd remembered, maybe in his mid-30s and far more composed. The sadness in his eyes was still there, but it was tempered by warmth. You came, he said, smiling as he crossed the room. I wasn't sure you would. I almost didn't, Grace admitted, cheeks warming. But my mom said I should. So here I am. I'm glad, Ethan said sincerely. And I owe you an apology. That night, I was out of control. It's not like me. Something happened, and I didn't handle it well. He didn't elaborate, and Grace didn't press. Whatever it was, it had cut deeply. It's fine, she said softly. I just didn't want you freezing out there. They spoke for a while about her studies, her part-time jobs, the way life had forced her to grow up faster than most. Ethan listened intently, and for reasons she couldn't explain, Grace felt strangely at ease. Then, almost without thinking, she asked, "Does your company ever need translators?" The question surprised even her. Ethan blinked, then let out a thoughtful hum. "Actually, yes. We've always hired freelancers for international negotiations, but I've been considering bringing someone in-house." Grace laughed nervously. "Well, I'm majoring in English and Mandarin. I'm not perfect yet, but I'm getting close." His eyes lit up. "That's impressive. And you're graduating soon." "In a few months." Ethan leaned back in his chair, smiling like someone who had just made up his mind. "Here's what I'll do. I can't offer you a full-time position yet, but how would you feel about a part-time internship? You'd work around your classes, help with smaller translation tasks, and get a feel for the company." Grace blinked. "Are you serious?" "Completely." His smile widened. "After what you did for me, the least I can do is offer an opportunity. Besides, something tells me you'd be good at this." As she left the office, the autumn sun spilling through the lobby windows, Grace felt something unfamiliar settle in her chest. Hope. For the first time in a long time, the future didn't feel like a distant dream. It felt like a door, cracked open, waiting for her to step through. 3 days later, Grace stood once again in the lobby of Caldwell Global Solutions, her heart pounding hard enough to make her fingertips tremble. She had spent the past 72 hours rehearsing answers to potential interview questions, ironing her one good blazer twice, and convincing herself that even if this opportunity vanished, she would be fine. But deep down, she knew it wasn't just another interview. It was a chance, maybe the first real one she'd ever had, to step into a future that didn't revolve around exhaustion and survival. The receptionist greeted her warmly and offered a glass of water before leading her down a corridor lined with framed accolades and photos of international partners. Grace's shoes made soft clicks against the polished floor, each step bringing a new wave of nerves. When the door to the main office opened, she found herself face to face with Richard Caldwell, the company's founder and CEO, and, as Ethan had mentioned, his father. He was nothing like she had expected. Older, yes, with silver at his temples and the kind of posture that spoke of decades spent leading boardrooms. But there was nothing cold or distant about him. His gaze was sharp but not unkind. And when he gestured for her to sit, his tone carried quiet authority rather than intimidation. "Grace Bennett," he said, glancing at her resume. A single page that felt painfully bare compared to what he was probably used to seeing. "You're in your final year at Portland State?" "Yes, sir," Grace replied, folding her hands tightly in her lap. "I'll graduate this spring." "And your focus is English and Mandarin?" She nodded. "I started studying Mandarin 2 years ago. I'm not fluent yet, but I'm confident with business vocabulary and written translation. English, of course, is my native language." Richard tapped his pen thoughtfully. "Why linguistics?" Grace took a breath, steadying her voice. "Because words matter. They build bridges or burn them. I've always believed that language can change outcomes, in business and diplomacy in life, and I want to be part of that process." It was the truth, and it was more passionate than she'd meant to sound. But Richard didn't seem put off. If anything, the faintest trace of a smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. "Tell me about your work experience," he said next. Grace's chest tightened. "It's not conventional," she admitted. "I've worked part-time since high school. Mostly service jobs, waitressing, childcare, handing out flyers. Nothing directly related to translation. But I think those jobs taught me something just as important: patience, listening, handling people. And they taught me how to work hard." Richard set the resume down and leaned back, studying her with an intensity that made her want to squirm. "You've had to grow up quickly," he said at last. "That's clear." "Yes, sir." "Do you know what we do here?" Grace nodded, grateful for the question. Caldwell Global Solutions helps companies expand into foreign markets. You handle translation and cultural consulting for negotiations, draft contracts, and manage cross-border partnerships. Good, Richard said, clearly pleased. Then he surprised her with a small, almost conspiratorial smile. And why do you think you belong here? The question hung heavy in the air. Grace's throat tightened, but she forced herself to meet his eyes. Because I want this. I know my resume isn't impressive, and I don't have the right connections or background. But I'm willing to learn, and I work harder than anyone I know. If you give me a chance, I won't waste it. The silence stretched for a beat too long. Then Richard stood and extended his hand. Welcome aboard, Ms. Bennett. Grace blinked. Wait, I'm hired. Internship, he corrected, the corners of his mouth softening. Part-time, as my son suggested. You'll assist our translation team and observe negotiations. If you prove yourself, we'll discuss something more permanent after graduation. For a second, she just stared, too stunned to speak. Then she rose quickly and shook his hand. Thank you. Thank you so much. Don't thank me yet, Richard said, though there was warmth in his voice. Now go to HR before I change my mind. The rest of the day passed in a blur. A cheerful woman from Human Resources named Janine walked her through the onboarding paperwork, explaining pay schedules, confidentiality policies, and the company handbook. A colleague named Melissa gave her a tour of the office. Open spaces filled with natural light, glass-walled conference rooms overlooking the Willamette River, and a break area with free coffee that felt fancier than any cafe Grace had ever worked in. When they showed her the small office that would be hers, once a storage room, now freshly painted and waiting for her, Grace had to swallow hard to keep her voice steady. It wasn't much. A desk, a chair, a computer, and a window with a view of the street below. But to her, it felt like a palace. By the time she left that afternoon, she was holding a folder of signed documents and a new employee badge. Her first paycheck, Janine explained, would arrive in 2 weeks. And when it did, it was nearly double what she earned in a month of late nights at the bar. That evening, Grace handed in her resignation at the bar with tears in her eyes. It was bittersweet. She'd spent 4 years there, surrounded by coworkers who had become like family. But as she walked out into the crisp autumn evening, the city lights flickering against the wet pavement, she felt a weight she hadn't realized she'd been carrying begin to lift. For the first time, her life wasn't about survival. It was about possibility. By the time a month had passed, Grace's life had reshaped itself into something she barely recognized. Gone were the endless double shifts and the frantic juggling of 3 different part-time jobs. Now, her days followed a new rhythm. Classes in the morning, afternoons at Caldwell Global Solutions translating documents or sitting quietly in on meetings, and evenings reserved for coursework and language drills. It was still exhausting. There were nights when she fell asleep over her textbooks, but the exhaustion felt different now. It wasn't the bone-deep weariness of survival. It was the kind that came from moving toward something. She grew into the role slowly. At first, Grace was terrified of making mistakes, second-guessing every email she drafted or sentence she translated. But the team was patient, guiding her through terminology quirks and corporate etiquette. Even Richard Caldwell, whose presence had intimidated her so much during the interview, stopped by occasionally to ask how she was settling in. "You'll do just fine here," he told her once, almost in passing, but the words buoyed her for days. And then there was Ethan. It started innocently enough. A quick hello when he passed her office, a question about how her classes were going. But soon those small exchanges became a daily occurrence. He would stop by mid-afternoon with a cup of coffee, just the way she liked it, or invite her to lunch at the little cafe 2 blocks away. Sometimes they talked about work, translation projects, upcoming negotiations, the company's expansion into Asian markets. Other times they spoke about nothing at all. Favorite books, childhood memories, the kind of movies they watched when they were too tired to think. Grace found herself looking forward to those lunches more than she wanted to admit. Ethan was easy to talk to, thoughtful, curious, with a quiet humor that slipped into conversations like sunlight through clouds. And though he was older than her by more than a decade, there was no sense of imbalance. He treated her as an equal, listening intently when she spoke, asking her opinion on things she barely felt qualified to discuss. On a gray December afternoon, with the sky low and heavy over the city, they met again for lunch. The cafe was warm and bustling, the windows fogged from the contrast between the winter chill outside and the steam inside. Grace wrapped her hands around her cup of tea and noticed Ethan seemed more subdued than usual. "Something's on your mind," she said gently. He hesitated, eyes drifting to the rain streaking down the window. "Today's a hard day," he admitted. "It's been 40 days since my mom passed." Grace blinked, caught off guard. "I'm so sorry, Ethan. I didn't know." He offered a faint smile that didn't reach his eyes. "It's okay. Most people don't. My father and I had a small memorial this morning, but it still feels raw." She didn't speak right away. She knew that kind of pain, the kind that doesn't vanish, just dulls around the edges. "I lost my dad when I was 10, she said softly. "For a long time, I thought the ache would never fade. Some days, it still hits me like it happened yesterday." Their eyes met across the table, a quiet understanding passing between them. Ethan exhaled slowly. "You know, I never planned to run this company. Not so soon, anyway. My father built it from nothing, and I always thought I'd take over someday. But not like this. Not while I was still trying to figure out how to breathe without her." Grace felt something twist in her chest. "That night," she said slowly, "the night we met, it was 40 days ago, wasn't it?" He nodded, surprised. "It was." "That means the night you ended up at the bar was the night of her memorial." Ethan gave a small, self-deprecating laugh. "Yeah, I wasn't handling it well. My father and I had an argument afterward about the future, about responsibilities. I walked out and tried to drink the weight of it away. It was selfish and reckless, but understandable," Grace said firmly. "Grief doesn't follow rules. And now you're here, carrying all of this on your shoulders." He looked at her then, really looked, as if seeing her for the first time. "You saved me that night, you know. I don't think I would have admitted it before, but you did. You kept me safe. And now, you're helping me keep this company safe too." Her cheeks flushed, and she stared down at her tea to hide the warmth rising in her chest. She wasn't used to hearing words like that. For a while, they sat in comfortable silence, listening to the rain drum against the windows. Grace's mind drifted back to that night, to the man slumped on a bench in the downpour, the decision to help when no one else had stopped. It felt like a lifetime ago, and yet here they were, their lives unexpectedly entwined because of it. When they left the cafe, the rain had slowed to a drizzle, and the streets shimmered under the glow of winter lights. Grace walked beside Ethan, her steps unconsciously matching his. Something was changing. She could feel it in the quiet spaces between their words, in the way his gaze lingered a little longer now. The future was still uncertain, but for the first time, she found herself looking forward to it. By the time spring settled over Portland, the rhythms of life at Caldwell Global Solutions had changed in more ways than one. Richard Caldwell, after decades of steering the company through expansions and crises, officially stepped back, naming Ethan as CEO. The announcement came quietly, a simple email to staff followed by a modest gathering in the main conference hall, but its significance wasn't lost on anyone. For Ethan, it marked the culmination of years of preparation and a responsibility he had once expected to inherit far later in life. For Grace, it signaled a new chapter for the man whose life had become so unexpectedly intertwined with hers. Their relationship, too, had deepened. It wasn't romantic, not yet, though something unspoken hummed between them. But there was a closeness now that hadn't existed before. Ethan trusted her opinion on translation strategy and often asked her to sit in on meetings just to hear her perspective. Grace, in turn, found herself confiding in him about things she rarely shared with anyone. Her anxieties about graduation, her dreams of working abroad, even stories about her father that she hadn't spoken aloud in years. It was during one of their usual afternoon check-ins, Ethan leaning against the doorframe of her small office, coffee in hand, that he first mentioned the meeting that would change everything. "Grace," he said, his tone more serious than usual, "I want to talk to you about something big. We have potential partners flying in from Beijing next month. They're interested in a joint venture that could triple our presence in Asia. If we land this deal, it could change the entire trajectory of Caldwell Global." Grace looked up from her laptop, heart skipping. "That's incredible." "It is," he agreed, then paused. "But it's also risky. These negotiations are going to be intense. Cultural nuances, legal complexities, financial stakes, everything. And I need someone I trust in that room." The implication sank in before he said it outright. "I want you there," Ethan continued. "Not just to translate documents, but to interpret live if necessary. There's a chance I'll have to speak off script, and I'll need you to follow along." Grace froze, fingers hovering over her keyboard. "Me? Ethan, I've only been here a few months. Shouldn't you hire someone with more experience?" He shook his head. "I could, but I don't want someone who just understands the language. I want someone who understands how I think. And that's you." Her heart pounded in her chest. She'd translated contracts, emails, and minor correspondence. She'd even sat quietly through a few smaller meetings. But this was different. A high-stakes negotiation with international investors was not just a step forward. It was a leap. "What if I mess up?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Then we'll fix it," Ethan said simply. "But I don't think you will." That night, Grace lay awake long after midnight, staring at the ceiling of her small apartment. Doubt gnawed at her, the fear of failing, of embarrassing herself and the company, of proving everyone who'd ever underestimated her right. But beneath the fear was something stronger: resolve. She hadn't come this far by playing it safe. She'd fought for every inch of ground she stood on, and she wasn't about to back down now. From that moment, preparation became her entire world. She pored over every detail she could find about the prospective partners, their company history, previous contracts, cultural etiquette, even the individual biographies of the delegation members. She reviewed her Mandarin notes every night until words swam in her vision, practiced real-time translation exercises with recordings of business speeches, and shadowed senior interpreters during internal meetings to absorb their techniques. Ethan, noticing her dedication, occasionally checked in with small pieces of advice. "Focus on intent, not just words," he reminded her one afternoon as they reviewed negotiation scenarios together. "What matters isn't just what they say, but what they mean." Grace nodded, scribbling the words into the notebook she carried everywhere. The weeks passed quickly, each day a step closer to the meeting. The office buzzed with anticipation, and even Richard, now semi-retired but still present as a board member, stopped by to offer encouragement. "You remind me of Ethan when he was starting out," he told Grace with a kind smile. "Nervous, but determined. That's a good combination." As the date approached, Grace's nerves sharpened into something like electricity, an anxious, restless energy that hummed beneath her skin. She practiced until she could switch between English and Mandarin without thinking, until her translations flowed as naturally as conversation. Still, on the eve of the meeting, her hands trembled slightly as she reviewed the final draft of the presentation materials. "This is the biggest thing I've ever done," she confessed quietly to herself. And it was bigger than any exam, any job interview, any decision she had made before. But it was also an opportunity, a chance to prove that she belonged here, not as a charity case or a temporary intern, but as someone capable of shaping the company's future. When Ethan stopped by her office the night before the meeting, he found her still at her desk, surrounded by papers and language notes. "You're ready," he said simply. Grace exhaled, setting down her pen. I hope so. I know so, Ethan replied. And tomorrow you'll prove it to them and to yourself. The words stayed with her long after he left, echoing in her mind as she turned off the lights and stepped into the cool spring night. Tomorrow everything would change, and for the first time, she felt ready to meet that change head-on. The morning of the negotiation dawned bright and clear, but Grace barely noticed the weather. Her stomach churned with nerves as she buttoned her blazer and checked her notes one last time. Every Mandarin term, every cultural nuance, every draft translation. She had reviewed them 100 times, and yet nothing could fully prepare her for what lay ahead. By 9 a.m., the top-floor conference room of Caldwell Global Solutions was a scene of deliberate precision. Polished wood gleamed under soft lighting, bottles of water lined the long table, and presentation screens glowed with the Caldwell logo. Ethan stood near the window, his usual calm replaced by focused intensity. When Grace entered, he gave her a reassuring nod. Not a smile, exactly, but a silent reminder that he believed in her. The delegation from Beijing arrived shortly after. 2 men, both impeccably dressed, both polite and formal. One appeared to be in his 50s, with sharp eyes and an air of quiet authority. The other, younger by at least a decade, carried himself with confidence that bordered on arrogance. They introduced themselves as Mr. Liu and Mr. Chen, representatives of a large investment firm interested in partnering with Caldwell Global. The meeting began smoothly. Ethan opened with a presentation outlining the company's growth strategy and the potential benefits of the proposed joint venture. Grace translated seamlessly when needed, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. Mr. Liu and Mr. Chen nodded along, occasionally asking clarifying questions. They seemed impressed, even enthusiastic, and the mood in the room remained positive as they moved through the agenda. By late morning, most of the major points had been discussed and agreed upon in principle. It was the kind of meeting executives dream of. No heated arguments, no cultural misunderstandings, no glaring disagreements. As they broke for a short coffee break before reviewing the final contract draft, Ethan caught Grace's eye and gave her a look that said, "We're doing it." Grace allowed herself a small breath of relief. Maybe she was overthinking everything. Maybe this would just be a straightforward success. But fate had other plans. Standing a few steps from the refreshment table, Grace was pouring herself tea when she heard voices behind her, Mr. Liu and Mr. Chen, speaking quickly in Mandarin. At first, she wasn't paying attention. Old habit. Then the words sank in. Lucky the old man didn't scrutinize the clause. Once the deal's signed, the assets transfer automatically. Exactly. By the time they realize what's happened, the money will be gone. Caldwell Global will be finished. And the lawyer? He's on board. Of course. He wants his share. He'd sell his own mother for the right price. Grace froze, her heartbeat thundering in her ears. For a moment, she wondered if she had misheard. Maybe her Mandarin wasn't as strong as she thought. Maybe they were talking about something else. But no, the words were unmistakable. These men weren't partners. They were predators. And their plan was already in motion. Her first instinct was panic. She glanced toward Ethan, laughing politely with Richard by the windows, completely unaware that the future of his company, the company he had just inherited, was hanging by a thread. Should she tell him privately? Would he even believe her? What if she was wrong? But there wasn't time to think. The legal team would return any minute with the finalized documents, and once Ethan signed them, Caldwell Global could be stripped bare. Grace's hands were trembling as she made her decision. When everyone returned to the conference room, she didn't go back to her corner seat. Instead, she walked to the center of the room and stopped. Every eye turned toward her. Ethan frowned, confused. "Grace," he asked quietly. She ignored him. Looking straight at Mr. Liu and Mr. Chen, she spoke 3 simple words in Mandarin. Words that translated roughly to "I know everything." The reaction was immediate. Mr. Chin stiffened, his confident posture crumbling. Mr. Liu's face drained of color, then flushed deep red. He muttered something sharp under his breath. Grace caught the word "stupid girl" before he yanked his briefcase from the table. "We're done here," he snapped in English, his tone icy. Without another glance at anyone, he stormed out. Mr. Chun hesitated only a second before following him, slamming the door so hard the walls rattled. The room fell into stunned silence. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Ethan's voice shattered the quiet. "What the hell was that?" he shouted, his face flushed with anger. "Do you have any idea what you've just done?" Grace's throat tightened. "Ethan, do you know how long I've been working on this deal?" He cut her off. "A year. A full year. And you just threw them out before we even signed." Her eyes burned, but she held his gaze. "I did it to protect you." "Protect me?" Ethan barked a bitter laugh. "From what?" "From success. From being robbed." Grace's voice rose to match his. "I heard them. They were talking in Mandarin during the break. They're planning to drain the company after the deal goes through. And your lawyer, the one you trust, they said he's already on their payroll." Ethan stared at her, stunned into silence. For a long, unbearable moment, neither of them moved. Then, without a word, he turned on his heel, grabbed the thick folder of draft contracts, and began reading. The room was so silent Grace could hear the soft rustle of paper as he flipped through page after page. With each passing minute, the anger on his face shifted from disbelief to confusion, then to something far more unsettling, dawning horror. And then, softly, Ethan whispered, "Oh my God!" The room remained utterly still as Ethan rifled through the contract. His hands trembling slightly with each page, he turned. Grace stood frozen near the center of the conference table, her pulse pounding in her ears. The adrenaline that had carried her through the confrontation was fading fast, leaving only fear. Fear that she had overstepped, that she had just destroyed the biggest deal of Ethan's career. Finally, he stopped on a section and read it again, his brow furrowing deeper with every line. Then he flipped backward, checked another clause, and his face went pale. "Oh my God," he whispered again, louder this time. "They changed it." Grace took a hesitant step forward. "What do you mean?" He turned the contract toward her, jabbing his finger at a paragraph buried in the dense legal language. This clause wasn't in the last draft. It states that once the joint venture is formed, a portion of our liquid assets, nearly 60%, would be transferred into a shared account under their control. It's disguised as a capital contribution adjustment. If I'd signed this, they could have drained the company overnight. The weight of his words hit her like a physical blow. She hadn't misheard. She hadn't overreacted. They really had been planning to destroy everything. "I told you," Grace said, her voice trembling. "I heard them. They even mentioned a lawyer working with them. Someone inside." Ethan's jaw clenched. "That explains why some of the legal language felt off. But I brushed it aside because I trusted our team." He slammed the folder shut, running a hand through his hair as he paced the length of the room. "I would have signed this today. I would have handed them the company my father spent his life building." Tears stung Grace's eyes. "I'm sorry I didn't tell you sooner. I didn't know how much time we had. And if I'd pulled you aside, they might have signed something, or Grace." Ethan's voice cut through her spiraling thoughts. She stopped. He was standing still now, just a few feet away, his expression no longer angry, just stunned, humbled. "You didn't ruin anything," he said softly. "You saved me." Her breath caught. You saved me," he repeated, his voice breaking. "That night in the rain. I was falling apart, and you didn't even know me, but you still helped." And today he looked down at the folder in his hands, then back up at her. "Today, you saved everything. Not just me, but my father's legacy, my employees' jobs, the company itself. Grace wiped at her cheeks, though the tears kept coming. I was just doing what anyone would do. No, he said firmly, shaking his head. Most people wouldn't have done anything. They would have stayed quiet or convinced themselves they misheard. But not you. You stood up and stopped a disaster before it happened. He stepped closer, closing the distance between them. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The tension in the air shifted, heavier now, but gentler too, something raw and real passing between them. Then, in a move that caught Grace completely off guard, Ethan sank down onto one knee. Her heart stopped. What are you doing? He let out a shaky breath, half a laugh and half a sob. Probably the most impulsive thing I've ever done, he admitted. But I don't care. Grace, you've changed my life twice now. Once by saving me when I was too broken to save myself. And now, by saving everything I've worked for. I don't want to wait another second to tell you what I already know. Her hands flew to her mouth as he reached for her trembling fingers. His eyes, bright, stormy, and impossibly sincere, locked onto hers. Please, he whispered, marry me. For a heartbeat, the world seemed to stop. The hum of the city below, the faint tick of the wall clock, even the sound of her own breathing faded into nothing. All she could hear were those 3 words echoing in the space between them. Ethan, she breathed, tears spilling freely now. Are you sure? This is so sudden. I've never been more sure of anything, he said, still on one knee, still holding her hand as if it were the only thing anchoring him to the earth. Everything in my life, the pain, the mistakes, even that night in the rain, it all led me here, to you. Something inside Grace shifted, the fear and doubt melting away under the weight of his words. She thought of that night, the rain, the bench, the decision to stop. She thought of every small moment since then, the way their lives had intertwined like threads drawn together by fate. And she realized that, somewhere along the way, she had fallen deeply, irrevocably in love with him. A laugh broke through her tears, soft and disbelieving. Yes, she whispered. Yes, I'll marry you. Ethan let out a breath that was almost a sob as he rose to his feet, pulling her into his arms. The folder, that cursed contract, fell forgotten to the floor as he held her tightly, the future he had nearly lost now brighter than he had ever imagined. In that sunlit conference room, surrounded by scattered papers and the echoes of a disaster narrowly averted, they both understood something deeply and completely. Their lives had changed forever, not by grand gestures or perfect plans, but by small acts of courage that had led them, unshakably, to each other. 6 months later, the city of Portland was bathed in the soft light of early summer, and Grace Bennett's world had transformed in ways she once wouldn't have dared to dream. The morning of her graduation dawned warm and golden, the kind of day that seemed to hum with promise. As she walked across the stage at Portland State University to receive her diploma, the roar of applause echoed in her ears, louder than she'd expected, fuller too. Somewhere in the crowd, Ethan stood next to her mother, clapping so hard his hands must have hurt. When the dean shook her hand and handed her the parchment, Grace felt a swell of emotion rise in her chest. It wasn't just a piece of paper. It was the culmination of sleepless nights, double shifts, tearful phone calls, and stubborn perseverance. It was proof that she had made it, that every sacrifice, every ounce of exhaustion had been worth it. A week later, in that same conference room where her life had changed forever, Grace signed a new contract, this time not as an intern, but as a full-time interpreter and cultural consultant for Caldwell Global Solutions. Richard Caldwell, now officially the chairman of the board, shook her hand warmly. "You've earned this," he said, smiling, "and something tells me this is only the beginning." She smiled back. "Thank you, Mr. Caldwell, for everything." "Richard," he corrected gently, "you're family now." The word made her cheeks flush. Family. It was still new on her tongue, but it felt right. Outside of work, life was just as full. She and Ethan were deep into wedding plans, an intimate ceremony scheduled for the fall, in a small vineyard just outside the city. They had chosen it for its simplicity. No extravagant guest list, no elaborate spectacle, just the people who mattered most. Every evening, after long days at the office, they would sit at their kitchen table with takeout containers and stacks of bridal magazines, laughing over flower arrangements and debating whether to serve pie instead of cake. The engagement had brought their families closer, too. Margaret, who had spent years locked in a quiet battle with her grief and health, had found a surprising source of joy in her conversations with Richard. They had bonded over shared stories of loss and parenthood, often lingering in the Caldwell family garden for hours, talking about everything from books to gardening to the strange ways life brought people together. "I never thought I'd see her smile like that again," Grace admitted one afternoon as she and Ethan strolled along the Willamette River, hand in hand. Ethan squeezed her fingers gently. "She raised someone extraordinary. I think she's finally realizing that she has every reason to be proud." Grace leaned her head against his shoulder. "We've both come a long way." They had. Sometimes, in quiet moments, Grace would catch herself looking back at the path that had brought her here. The exhausted student racing between classes and bar shifts. The stranger on a rainy night who had needed help. The terrifying moment in a boardroom when she had spoken 3 words that could have cost her everything, or saved it. Each of those moments, insignificant on their own, had woven together into the tapestry of the life she now lived. And she thought often of that night in the rain. It had been an ordinary decision, one born not of strategy or ambition, but of simple kindness. She had seen someone in need and chosen to help. That single choice had set into motion a chain of events that changed not only her life, but Ethan's too. It was humbling and miraculous all at once. The evening before their wedding invitations were sent out, Grace sat on the small balcony of their apartment, watching the sunset wash the city in gold and rose. Ethan joined her, 2 mugs of tea in hand, and pressed a kiss to the top of her head before settling into the chair beside her. "Do you ever think about how unlikely this was?" he asked quietly. "All the time," she admitted. "I think about how I almost didn't stop that night, how I almost walked away." He smiled. "I think about how lucky I was that you didn't." They sat in silence after that, content just to breathe the same air, the weight of their shared past and future settling gently between them. When autumn finally came and Grace walked down the aisle toward Ethan, her heart was calm. She wasn't the frightened girl who had once scraped together tips to pay the rent. She wasn't the student terrified of failing. She wasn't even just the woman who had saved a company. She was all of those things and more, stronger, wiser, deeply loved. And as she stood beside Ethan, surrounded by the people who had shaped her journey, Grace understood something profound. She was no longer merely surviving. She was building a career, a family, a future. It had all begun with a single moment of compassion on a rainy night. And now, as she stepped into the next chapter of her life, she carried with her the unshakable truth that she was not at the mercy of fate. She was the author of it,